Hello, everyone. Dr. Mad here. Let's get mad about an inspector calls. So we are almost at the end of Act 2. This is where we got to. So if you remember, the inspector is now interviewing Mrs. Burling about why she refused to help Eva Smith. So let's listen to a bit more of the audio and then we'll go through it as usual.
No, you haven't. Simply because I've done nothing wrong, and you know it.
I think you did something terribly wrong. And that you're going to spend the rest of your life regretting it. I wish you'd been with me tonight in the infirmary. You'd have seen me.
No, please. I've imagined it enough already.
Then the next time you imagine it, just remember that this girl was going to have a child. Really?
Oh, horrible. How could she have wanted to kill herself?
Because she'd been turned out and turned down too many times.
Mother, you must have known.
It was because she was going to have a child that she went for assistance to your mother's committee.
Look here. This wasn't Gerald Croft.
Oh.
No. Nothing to do with him.
Thank goodness for that. Though I don't know why I should care now.
And you've nothing further to tell me, Mrs. Burling.
I'll tell you what I told her. Go and look for the father of the child. It's his responsibility.
That doesn't make it any the less yours. She came to you for help at a time when no woman could have needed it more. She was alone, friendless, almost penniless, desperate. She needed not only money, but advice, sympathy, friendliness. And you slammed the door in her face.
Mother, that was cruel and vile.
I must say, Sybil, that when this comes out at the inquest, it isn't going to do us much good.
Oh, stop it, both of you. And before you start accusing me of anything, please remember that it wasn't I who had her turned out of her employment, which probably began it all. In the circumstances, I think I was justified. The girl had begun by telling us a pack of lies. Afterwards, when I got at the truth, I discovered that she knew who the father was. So I told her it was her business to make him responsible. If he refused to marry her, and in my opinion he ought to be compelled to, then he must at least support her.
And what did she reply to that?
Oh, she was giving herself ridiculous airs, claiming elaborate fine feelings and scruples that were simply absurd in a girl in her position.
What did she say?
She said that the father was only a youngster, silly and wild and drinking too much. There couldn't be any question of marrying him. It would be wrong for them both. He had given her money, but she didn't want to take any more money from him.
Why didn't she want to take any more money from him?
Oh, some fancy reason. As if a girl of that sort would ever refuse money.
I warn you, you're making it worse for yourself. What reason did she give for not taking any more money?
Her story was...
Okay, let's stop there and let's go back to where we were. Okay, so Mrs. Burling continues to insist that she hasn't done anything wrong. And then the main point here is the revelation that Eva Smith was pregnant. And obviously that's a very serious and significant revelation. So here Sheila is horrified. Priestley uses exclamations, and this is an exclamation, repetition, and what about this? What about this thing here? Rhetorical question. Although in this case he does actually answer her question. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so obviously the inspector says that this is the very reason why she went for help, and Mr. Burling's initial concern is that it wasn't Gerald Croft who was the father of the child. And then here's this word responsibility again. And what techniques can you see in these lines here? Emotive language, so alone, desperate, and he makes the point. So notice again the audio version does cut out quite a few bits. It seems to cut out some quite important bits, really. It's a bit strange. But it's a modern version, so maybe that's why. Anyway, so he says, oh, you've got children. You should know what it's like. Okay, so Sheila says it was cruel and vile. Now, the fact that she's saying this to her mother is really significant. The vile means really nasty. Okay, but notice here, Berling, what do you notice about Berling's reaction? He's still not concerned about Eva Smith. All he's concerned about is the bad publicity that they're going to get. I mean, he's really unthinking about other people. He really has no empathy whatsoever. And now Mrs. Berling is starting to get agitated, which means troubled or nervous. But notice again, she still does not accept responsibility. She still feels, well, actually, it turns out that Eva was not telling lies. She was telling the truth, mostly, really. I mean, technically, of course, she wasn't Mrs. Berling, but 99% she was pretty much telling the truth. But regardless of that, the fact remains she was pregnant, she needed help, and in that situation, just because somebody tells a lie doesn't mean you don't help a pregnant woman. That is the most vulnerable state a person can be in. And then, so all of this, as you know, Eric is going to turn out to be the father, and this is why Priestley has reversed the characters. Yeah, so in the story, in real life, in the story, Eva Smith meets Eric before Mrs. Berling, but here it's reversed for dramatic effect. We have so we can see Mrs. Berling saying, "Oh, the father is responsible," and obviously at this point she doesn't realize that she's talking about her own son. Okay, and then we can skip the next bit here. Although this I've made me finally lose all patience with her. So keep in mind, she is talking about a woman, a vulnerable woman who has turned up, who is pregnant, and all Mrs. Berling cares about is her own feelings rather than Eva Smith's feelings. Okay, and then here she's saying how she gave herself ridiculous airs, meanings. This is when she pretended to be Mrs. Berling, Eva Smith. And notice here, even now, she's still talking about class structure, about how Eva Smith, being a working class girl, she wouldn't have put on these ridiculous airs. So notice how at the end of all this, it's going to be Eva Smith, the working class girl, who actually turns out to be the most principled person, the most ethical and moral person in the whole play, as we'll see in. Well, we've seen that already, but we're going to see more of it. And he says her position now is that she's like burnt out. So again, emotive language. And now it's the inspector losing all patience. In the previous slide, Mrs. Berling was saying that, but now inspector is saying that, despite the fact that he's lower working class and they are kind of middle and upper class. And then notice here, I mean, somebody who's watching the play carefully will have worked out by now that it's Eric who's the father, because we know he's young, we know he's silly and wild, we know that Eric drinks too much. And then we learned that he had given her some money, but then she doesn't want to take any more. And we're going to find out why in a minute. And again, a girl of that sort. So again, saying that a working class girl would not refuse to take money, but we know that she did. Okay, let's listen to a bit more of the audio.
That he'd said something one night when he was drunk that gave her the idea that it wasn't his money.
Where had he got it from then?
He'd stolen it.
So she'd come to you for assistance because she didn't want to take stolen money.
That's the story she finally told, after I'd refused to believe her original story, that she was a married woman who'd been deserted by her husband. I didn't see any reason to believe that one story should be any truer than the other. Therefore, you're quite wrong to suppose I shall regret what I did.
But if her story was true, if this boy had been giving her stolen money, then she came to you for help, because she wanted to keep this youngster out of any more trouble.
Possibly. But it sounded ridiculous. So I was perfectly justified in advising my committee not to allow her claim for assistance.
You're not even sorry now, when you know what happened to the girl.
I'm sorry she should have come to such a horrible end, but I accept no blame for it.
Who is to blame, then?
First, the girl herself.
For letting Father and me have her chucked out of her jobs.
Oh, no.
Secondly, I blame the young man who was the father of the child she was going to have. If, as she said, he didn't belong to her class and was some drunken young idler, then that's all the more reason why he shouldn't escape. He should be made an example of. If the girl's death is due to anybody, then it's due to him.
And if her story is true, that he was stealing money...
Then he'd be entirely responsible, because the girl wouldn't have come to us and have been refused assistance if it hadn't been for him.
So he's the chief culprit, anyhow.
Certainly. And he ought to be dealt with very severely.
Mother, stop.
Be quiet, Sheila.
But don't you see?
You're behaving like a hysterical child tonight, Sheila.
Oh,
Inspector, if you take some steps to find this young man and make sure that he's compelled to confess in public his responsibility, instead of staying here asking unnecessary questions, then you really would be doing your duty.
Don't worry, Mrs. Burling. I shall do my duty.
I'm glad to hear it.
No hushing up, eh? Make an example of the young man, eh? Public confession of responsibility.
Certainly. And now, no doubt, you'd like to say good night.
Not yet. I'm waiting.
Waiting for what?
To do my duty.
now, Mother, don't you see?
But surely... I mean... It's ridiculous.
Inspector, you're not trying to tell us that my boy is mixed up in this?
If he is, then we know what to do, don't we? Mrs. Burling has just told us.
My God. Oh, but look here.
I don't believe it. I won't believe it.
Mother, I begged you to stop, but would you...
You all know, don't you?
Okay, so on that dramatic note, let's go back. So notice how in the audio version, it carries straight on to Act 3, it doesn't stop. So remember the three unities, time, place, and action. But anyway, we'll talk more about that later. Let's just go back to where we were. Actually, I think we stopped here on this slide. Okay, so this slide we can just skip, except to note that the young boy had stolen the money. And here the main thing to notice is how she is digging herself further and further into a hole. And so firstly, she blames the girl, obviously Eva Smith. That's no surprise. But now, secondly, she blames the young man, which she doesn't know is her son. And she describes him as some drunken young idler. So idler is somebody who is lazy, who doesn't do anything, and he shouldn't escape. He should be made an example of. It's all his responsibility. Okay, so let's move to the next slide. And here she just keeps digging and digging, entirely responsible. That word again, although in Mrs. Burling's case, she's kind of using it in a negative way. And she makes it very, very clear that this young man, who she doesn't know is her son, is the main person to blame. He should be dealt with very severely, so very strictly. And now, of course, Sheila suddenly realizes who they're talking about. Priestley uses repetition and also here exclamations. But notice that it's the young person who suddenly realizes the older people, the parents, they still haven't caught on yet. And Mrs. Berling uses that word again. So to remember, we wouldn't normally use this word nowadays against women, but initially Sheila used it against herself, and now Mrs. Berling, her mother, another woman, is using it towards another woman. And here she just keeps digging, that he should be made to confess, and that Inspector Berling should do his duty. So all of this. So this is fairly straightforward. You can pause the video and read through this if you want to. And Sheila is getting more and more distressed. And finally, Mr. and Mrs. Berling start to catch on. And now it's clear. So we are coming to the end of the dramatic Act 2. I begged you and begged you. What technique is that? Repetition. And there's the end of Act 2. But we do have time in this video to do the summary and the revision. So that's what we're going to do now. So let's have a look at the summary. So Gerald met Eva Smith, or Daisy Renton, at the Palace Bar. He gave her a place to stay and had a relationship with her whilst being with Sheila at that time. But once he'd had enough, Gerald told Eva to leave and gave her some money. She went to the seaside where she kept a rough sort of diary. Sheila gives Gerald back the engagement ring when she learns all this. Next, the inspector interviews Mrs. Sybil Burling, who is a prominent member of the Bromley Women's Charity Organization. So prominent means, in this case, it means senior or important member. We learn that Sybil Burling refused to help Eva Smith, even though she was pregnant, because Eva called herself Mrs. Burling. And the reason she did that was because she was pregnant with Eric Burling's child. So on the one hand, they weren't technically married. So in that sense, she did lie a little bit, but it sort of makes sense. Sybil Burling digs herself into a hole, saying that the father of the child is fully responsible and should be made to pay and made an example of, without realizing that she is talking about her own son, Eric. We learn that the young man stole money to give to Eva, but when she found out that it was stolen, she refused to take any more. The father offered to marry her, but she refused because he was too young and wild and irresponsible. We finally learn that Eric was the father of Eva's baby, although towards the end, I think most people in the audience would have worked it out, and in fact, Sheila works it out, doesn't she? And then eventually even Mr. and Mrs. Burling do. Okay, so here are the questions for the summary, simple questions. I won't read through the questions, they're fairly straightforward. So please pause the video here, answer these questions. If you struggle, then you need to go back and certainly revise the summary. And if you're really struggling, then you need to possibly watch all the Act 2 videos again. But if you can get like 50% or more, then that's fine. So I'm going to move to the answer slide in 3 seconds. So please pause the video here and answer these questions. And then when you're ready to check your answers, I'm going to move to the next slide in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. So there are the answers. So again, I won't go through these here. The only thing I will say is this last one. So Priestley reverses Sybil and Eric so that Sybil can dig herself into this hole before we find out that it's her son who's the father. Whereas if the inspector interviews Eric first and we find that out straight away, then we won't have that same dramatic effect. Okay, so pause the video here to check your answers. I'm going to move to the next slide in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1, and moving now. Okay. So what I'm going to do here is I'm not going to go through these quotations like I did with Act 1, because I think you should be able to do that now. What I'm going to do is just show you what you need to do, which is this. So here we have one slide, 2, 3. Okay, we've got 3 pages of quotations. All right, what I want you to do is to reduce these quotes by a third. Which ones do you think are the most important? And then compare them with my version. So here, what you need to do is cut these by a third. I'm not saying it will be exactly a third in each page, but roughly speaking. So pause the video here, cut it by a third, and then go to the next slide. Okay. So I'm going to go to the next slide in 3 seconds now. 3, 2, 1, and moving. And now do the same again, cut these by a third. So I'm going to move to the next slide in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Do the same here. Pause the video, please. I'm going to the next slide in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay. So once you've done that, if you need to go back, please do. But I'm now going to move to the next slide, or the next 2 slides where I'll show you my versions. I mean, don't worry if they're not exactly the same. It's really the process of going through this that's important. That's what's going to help you to remember what's going on so that you can answer the questions in the exam. Okay, so moving to the next slide in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so pause the video here and compare your version with mine. Like I said, it doesn't have to be exactly the same. Okay, so I'm going to move to the next slide in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so that's the second slide. So compare yours with mine now. And moving to the next slide in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. So this is what you needed to have done to reduce the above quotations by a half. Not sorry. So that's that. Now, okay. So what you've got now is 2 pages of quotations similar to mine. What you need to do now is cut those even further by a half. So you're going to end up with a page, but actually less than a page, because I don't want you to just reduce the number of them, but the quotations themselves. So remember, the ideal quote is about 2 or 3 words. Okay. I mean, it can be a bit longer than that. And the version I'm going to show you actually is a little bit longer, but that's what we're kind of aiming for. Okay, so pause the video here and make sure and cut those 2 pages down to a half. And moving to the answer slide in 3 seconds. So 3, 2, 1. Now here I will go through this in a bit more detail now that we're down to the final version. So firstly, you should have something like this, and then also you're going to answer these questions in a minute. So notice here the inspector talking about Sheila, and there's a technique being used here, and there's a major theme here. And this is Inspector Gould talking about the young people. So there's a theme there. This is Mrs. Burling. There's a theme there. This is Gerald talking about these kind of women he hates, and yet he goes to this place knowing that's the sort of women who are going to be there. Those are the sort of women who are going to be there. And then this is Inspector Gould. This is a plot device from Priestley. And here we have a stage direction when Sheila obviously does this when she realizes what's been going on. This is Mr. Burling defending Gerald instead of taking his daughter's side. There's a theme there. And this is Inspector Gould saying that public men have responsibilities as well as privileges. There's a theme there. And then this is Mrs. Burling talking about Eva Smith, that she only had herself to blame. This is Mrs. Burling again saying it's the young father's responsibility. There's a theme there. And this is Mrs. Burling again talking about girls of that sort. There's a theme there. This is Mrs. Burling again saying that the father is entirely responsible. And then here we have the Eric coming back, the stage direction. So answer these questions, please. I don't need to go through them. They're fairly straightforward. So pause the video here and answer these questions. And I'm going to move to the answer slide in 3 seconds. So 3, 2, 1. So yeah, the first question, emotive language, and that word in particular, in case you weren't sure. Theme of generations, so the older and the younger generations, increasingly making the point that younger people are easier to make an impression on, which can be good or bad, but in this case, good. And some of these, if you haven't got exactly the same answers, that's okay, as long as they're kind of 90% similar. And final important point is that remember that word classes are also techniques. So what do we mean by word classes? We mean nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs. So sometimes you pick out a quote and there isn't necessarily a technique like similes or metaphors or personification. That's okay. So how do you get the marks for terminology? The answer is you use word classes. You identify the word class of the word that you picked out. So remember, when you answer a question and you write a paragraph, you pick out a quote, you explain the quote, you talk about the effects of that quote, what kind of thoughts, feelings, images does it raise in the audience's mind, and then you ideally zoom into individual words, talk about their connotations, additional meanings, identify the word class. Okay? Okay, right. So that's the end of Act 2. As always, please do subscribe and tell all your friends if you found this video useful. And I will see you in the next video for Act 3, the final act of Inspector Calls.